Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of this year's USC Institute on Inequalities and Global Health virtual lecture series. My name is Sofia Gruskin, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this incredibly exciting event. Learning from our histories, activism in a post-Roe world, a conversation with, if I may say, the wonderful Loretta Ross. This event is done in partnership with the USC Law and Global Health Collaboration, our wonderful steering committee of folks from across the university concerned with the impacts of the Dobbs decision, the USC Keck School of Medicine Office of Social Justice, and the Kasom Center for Gender Equity in Medicine and Science. And on our collective behalf, welcome. The issues around sexual and reproductive health and rights here in the US and around the world that are being impacted by the recent Supreme Court decision and what we do about it is clearly on all of our minds. This is a theme for this event and for the events that are to follow. Over this semester, we're going to be doing a series of events on the impacts of the Dobbs decision with attention to services, to law, and to politics. So please stay tuned. But I'm sure you won't be surprised. We thought it best to start with this dialogue. And with that, I couldn't be more excited by this start of our series, nor can I think of anyone better placed with whom to have this conversation. And actually, when I say conversation, I mean conversation, as one of the exciting things is that Professor Ross has asked that we run this as a conversation rather than as a lecture. So on that point, one small piece of housekeeping, please. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll be collecting these questions in our last minute. Hopefully there'll be some time for discussion. So now let me say a few words about Loretta J. Ross. She's an associate professor at Smith College. She is an activist. She's a public intellectual and a scholar. And as you know from her biography, she started her career in activism and social change in the 1970s before the Roe decision. And over her career, she's been with the National Football League Players Association, the DC Rape Crisis Center, the National Organization for Women, the National Black Women's Health Project, the Center for Democratic Renewal, the National Center for Human Rights Education. She co-founded Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. And while that's all true, I have to say I had the immense fortune to meet Loretta decades ago in the early 1990s, and I've therefore been able to follow her work and the amazing things that she's done. But what I want to point out is that it's not just what she's done, but the way she's done these amazing things. And so I'm very, very grateful she's agreed to kick off our lecture series. And like I said earlier, our collective focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights is key as a way to engage with all that's happening and also all that needs to be done. And we've got much to learn from the work that Loretta's done in the US and around the world. And like I'm gonna keep saying this, but also the way she's done it. And so my hope is that our discussion today can help set the tone for how we can all best engage with reproductive justice in the current moment. And with that, let me start by saying, hi, Loretta. And I guess, let me start with the big question. So how do you think that the reversal of Roe v. Wade is going to affect us all as people, but also as students, as practitioners, as activists, and the issues we work on? What's changed? What's the same? And what are some of the bigger concerns for the future?
Obviously, well, first of all, thank you for having me and your series. But obviously, as they put more and more barriers in the way of people controlling their bodies, things are going to get worse. So women and people capable of getting pregnant are going to have even more barriers if they happen to live in the same zip code, in the wrong zip code that doesn't provide increased access to abortion and contraception and all the other reproductive health services that people deserve as their human rights. So that's going to be much worse. At the same time, I'm really surprised that they issued the Dobbs decision ahead of the midterm elections, because that has provided a real energetic boost to women registering to vote, even in the red states. I would have thought that they would have held off issuing Dobbs until after the midterm elections. And so they've offered a gift to those of us who care about women's human rights, because we're now seeing an upsurge in interest and attention on abortion because since Ronald Reagan, we've been claiming that the Republicans were trying to overthrow Roe v. Wade, but we felt like Chicken Little. Nobody listened. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. And then Dobbs showed that the sky could fall, and it did. And so it has a complicated effect in terms of mobilizing our base of people, expanding our base of people. Obviously, the Kansas victory was not done by Democratic women because there aren't enough Democrats registered in Kansas to even have that outcome that it had. So it woke the sleeping giant of pro-choice Republican women. And I don't think that was their goal.
I hear you. I hear you. I really appreciate the positive in terms of what you're saying. And because that is kind of, I've been, I guess in my own head, it's just been kind of so much in the negative. And so I really appreciate you taking that forward. What do you think it's going to be necessary to keep activism kind of active in the communities with which you work? Like, what is it going to take for people to stay mobilized and to realize what it is that needs to be done? And I'm thinking specifically the communities where you work, but I'm also thinking kind of more generally when we think about how this is going to affect society kind of broadly over time. What are the things that we need to really keep focused on?
I wish I had the formula for how to keep people woke. I mean, because many of us mistakenly thought after the George Floyd murder that America was going to wake up from its sleepwalking through issues of racial justice. And by the end of the summer, America had gone back to sleep. Whether or not this will be a sustained acknowledgement that women's rights are under attack, as well as LGBT rights and environmental justice and all the other things that the Supreme Court could undermine, voting rights and all of that, whether or not the American public as a whole stays awake is anybody's bet. I just really have been disappointed so many other times when I said this is going to be the one that really makes people here for the long term. And then, the next celebrity scandal just wipes it off the front pages. And part of it is media manipulation as well. Let's be honest, it's not just the American public, it is the way that the media chooses to keep the public disengaged. I mean, we just looked at one of the most important speeches that President Biden has given in his administration, and all three major networks chose to run reruns instead of broadcast the president's speech live because he was talking about the threat to democracy, and they showed reruns. And so that is an intentional choice to keep the American public disengaged from the issues of the day. So I can't predict how we're going to respond to Dobbs 6 months from now.
Right. No, I hear you. And everything you're saying, just resonates. I mean, I think, one of the things that I'm thinking about is what it's going to mean also for people who are seeking abortions, for people being forced to carry to term, and basically what it's going to mean in terms of basically people's lives. We're already seeing changes. I mean, in terms of what it means in some states. And I guess my question to you about that is when you think about kind of all the parade of horribles, if I can put it that way, in terms of kind of the way that things are going, are there things that you think we should be particularly aware of for communities in terms of what this is going to mean? Things that are not kind of right up on our agendas right up off the bat?
Well, we have to keep the most vulnerable people in the center of our lands, because while some states are increasing their protection of abortion rights, like Massachusetts, where I'm presently, other states are doing their best to make it much worse on people and don't really care if women die because they're very callous and indifferent to the consequences of their abortion bans. Uh, and so we have to make sure that we keep the most vulnerable people in the center of the lens so that whatever we do, both legal and extra legally, we do. For example, making sure that we keep the supply of abortion pills going, whether it's legal or not. Let's keep doing that. If we have to establish an underground railroad and help people get from to different states so that they can better access services, that's what we have to do. We actually need to make sure that we have a sturdy, a strong pool of human rights defenders who are ready to serve as legal counsel to people who may get arrested for the services that they're trying to provide. I believe the group If Now When is thinking about serving in that role.
So,
But the number one thing we have to do is make sure that the people who most need it have the information that they have options, because so much of the media is saying Roe's overturned, Dobbs pleaded, there's no conversation really happening in the mainstream media about how people still have options.
no, I think that that's super important, and I agree. I mean, obviously, I agree. And so it's like one of those things in terms of how do we do that most effectively. I guess I'm also really struck. You mentioned human rights defenders. Okay, can we talk about human rights for a moment? Because I think one of the ways we first connected, right, was around links to human rights. And so I guess why, like, just taking a step back, why of all the frameworks that are out there have you chosen to take a human rights approach to reproductive justice? No, like, could you, how is it been useful to you? Has there times when it's been less useful? How does it work? And in terms of thinking about other approaches to mobilizing folks and to try to make change?
Well, for me, it's probably relatively simple because I have a rock solid belief in the wisdom of ancestors. And so when people starting in 1858, Frederick Douglass is calling it a human rights violation when a black man is lynched in New York City. And then 110 years later, Martin Luther King says the phrase human rights and that we need to build a human rights revolution here in the United States. And Malcolm X says it and Audre Lorde says it. I'm not that smart. All I have to do is listen to the ancestors and not think that I'm going to out King, outdo Douglas in thinking about what framework to use. And so it's not a debate for me. Obviously, we've got the intransigence of the U.S. government that never ever met a human rights treaty that it likes. And so that's why it hopes to get away with violating people's human rights with impunity, because it takes advantage of the fact that the American public doesn't know much about human rights, which is why I founded the National Center for Human Rights Education, because the American public doesn't know much about human rights, and you can't fight for rights you don't know you have. And so, but framing all of our intersectional and interconnected struggles as human rights was relatively easy for me because all I had to do was listen to the ancestors. I didn't have to figure it out myself. Now, there are a lot of skeptics, critics, and naysayers when it comes to the human rights framework, but they're largely concerned, and legitimately so, about the weaknesses of the state-based system monitoring and implementation system. They know that the United States gets away with violating people's human rights with very few consequences. So because the US violates people's human rights with impunity, they tend to devalue the human rights framework as a way of holding the United States accountable. And there are people who see it as a Western imposition onto other traditions and cultures and stuff. And I take all of that into account. But the thing that I'm push back on is that since the social justice movements in the United States have never used the human rights framework effectively, I wonder why we are so disdainful of it. It's like we haven't even tried riding the bike. We already know the bike won't work. You know?
I got you. So let me ask you on that. So what could you be specific about what a human rights approach to reproductive justice could look like what it could bring us?
Well, the fundamental human right that you start with is bodily autonomy, the right to determine what happens to your body. That if you don't have the right to bodily self-determination, all the rest of your rights are going to be very, very hard to secure. And I really like the opening preamble of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when they say all human beings are born equal in rights and dignity. And I've always felt that that was one of the most powerful statements that I can use to teach people about equality, about justice, about being born, to push back on the anti-abortion movement that seems to want to claim rights for people not even here while they trample on the rights of people who are here. Um, and so bodily autonomy uh, is one. When you look at Article 25, for example, of the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they talk about people needing things necessary to live a life of dignity, like health care and housing and social services if they're not able to take care of themselves and stuff. I think that's also one of the reasons I really gravitate towards the UDHR, because it articulates
Mhm.
meeting people's needs as human rights, not as special entitlements, but actually things you deserve because simply because you're human and no one gets to vote on your humanity. And so I like the universality of of the human rights framework, that is not based on where you're born or who you born or your particular identity. Everyone has the same human rights, even though our intersectional identities require that we pay attention to our vulnerabilities so that we can attend to those, so that we can all enjoy the same human rights, the same way that, all children have a human right to an education, for example, but a blind child might need her books in braille.
Mhm. Yeah.
You have to pay attention to her vulnerabilities in order to ensure that she has the same human rights as a sighted child. And I like that inclusivity of the human rights framework, because for us to all have the same human rights, we have to pay attention to our individual characteristics and vulnerabilities. So it's an and approach rather than an either or approach.
I really appreciate that. I totally, I really hear you on that. And, it opens up, one of the things that because I've been reading up about a lot of your recent work. And one of the things is that you've been talking a lot about transformative human rights conversations. And I would like to, could you say a little bit what you mean by a transformative human rights conversation? I feel like I just heard one. So I'd like to know kind of, is that kind of what you're talking about? Is that where that goes?
Well, I'm not quite sure what context you were here encountering that phrase, but one of the things I learned when I was monitoring hate groups and deprogramming people in the white supremacist movement is that I quickly realized that I couldn't defend human rights while violating them at the same time. And that was actually very frustrating to me, because I had no problem hating people who'd been in the Klan and the neo-Nazi movement and the militia movement. I mean, really? And so my boss at the time was Reverend C.T. Vivian, who'd been an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King. And he had said that when you ask people to give up hate, then you need to be there for them when they do. And at the time he first told me that, I didn't understand what he was talking about. But as I got to know people who were caught up in the white supremacist movement, and then I couldn't dehumanize them once I got to know them, oh, I reluctantly admitted that they had the same human rights that I was fighting to protect for myself. So I had to learn how to work with them in a way that didn't dehumanize them or violate their human rights. And so now when I think of transformative human rights, I try to urge people to do work for women's rights, but not do it in a transphobic way,
Mhm.
or do work for trans rights without doing it in a misogynist, anti-woman way, or do work for civil rights without being homophobic. or do work for gay rights without being racist. I mean, all of these things are necessary because we are different sectors of the same human rights movement. And so we have to do the work in such a way that we don't create contradictions within our own movement.
That makes total sense. And I do feel now I do totally get the transformative human rights conversation in that sense. So that really works for me. You know, one of the things I'm really struck with is the work you've done domestically, but also the work you've done in other parts of the world. And, you know, in this moment with the way in which, with the rollback of Roe, but also the advancement around reproductive justice in other countries and the ways in which other countries have addressed criminalization of abortion and the rollbacks on women's bodily autonomy and kind of the push forward in a lot of places. You know, are there lessons that you think we should be particularly mindful of from other parts of the world that we can really learn from in terms of as we think about how we mobilize and act at this point?
Well, the United States doesn't have a lot of known experience in living under a fascist dictatorship. And we're quickly rolling that way, right? I mean, if Trump and his minions aren't held accountable, if they are seen as above the law and able to subvert all of our democratic institutions and set themselves up in permanent power as a minority, imposing their will upon the majority, we need to learn from the global South how to live under dictatorships because we don't have that lived experience, you know, unless you describe the enslavement and of course settler colonialism as part of that. But I'm saying, you know, for the modern period, we don't know what it's like to try to find political space within a dictatorship. And so people around the world, particularly in the global South, have much of that to teach us. I wrote an article in 2005 after the Katrina catastrophe in New Orleans about how we needed to learn from people in Palestine what statelessness looked like, you know, not having identification, those kinds of things, because when you're refugees in your own country, you have to learn from people in other countries how to handle that. What are the experiences that you need to know about? What knowledge do you need to obtain? And in this post liberal democracy world that we're quickly approaching, I don't know what's going to come next after the collapse of neoliberal democracy, but it seems like I should be paying attention to it because the pillars of democracy are being kicked out in plain sight. Where, you know, you got the politicization of the judiciary, the evisceration of the executive office, of the executive powers, the intentional deconstruction of the educational system and the media. I mean, I don't know how we're going to withstand this assault on democracy, particularly when we can't name the problem as neo-fascism or as President Biden said, semi-fascism. I don't think there's anything semi about it. It quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, as far as I'm concerned.
Um, let me ask you then, in terms of thinking about kind of our own history as a country, right? I mean, do you think that there's anything that we can learn from, let's say, even before Roe, right? In terms of kind of political mobilizing that happened historically within this country? Is there anything that you think is important for us to keep in mind now moving forward?
Well, we have a tendency not to know how to analyze our own history very well. Um, of course, if we'd held the traitors accountable after the Civil War in 1865, we wouldn't have seen the Confederate flag in the US Capitol in 2021. So we have a tendency to not know our history and not hold the people who have done damage and harm historically accountable, even in the moment. And so that's why I'm so concerned that if we don't hold these present day insurrectionists and the people who manipulated them accountable, then like President Grant, we're going to be facing insurrection after insurrection after insurrection. And that's what we're going to be dealing with. But the more immediate history, I think, is important to realize is that after the, as part of coming out of the Depression, uh, Roosevelt and the Democrats didn't organize the New Deal because they wanted to be benevolent. They organized it, and in the Keynesian sense, because they knew that populism uh, at the base level was turning towards socialism. And if they didn't ameliorate the most negative impacts of capitalism, they couldn't hold on to capitalism because too many people who were being left out of the benefits of capitalism were turning towards socialism. And so I think we're kind of at that tipping point now. Not that I'm, advocating for socialism or any of the things. I think all of these economic systems created by white men suck because they all fail to really deal with race and gender in any substantive way. So, but still, I think that there's a risk of people trying to figure out what a post-liberal democracy future looks like and may turn to socialism again or some form of it. And so I see the Democrats trying to keep their finger in the dike to keep that from happening, which is why they're angrier at the Bernie Sanders wing of the party than uh, you know, the Munchin wing of the party. So kind of funny.
Yeah. So let me take us back then for a moment, because one of the things also in your recent work, which is this focus on calling in rather than calling out individuals and groups, is something that you're engaged with. And so given what you just said, right, which makes 100% sense, what does it mean to call in? What tactics do you think would be appropriate for calling in, and that we should focus on in specifically with a focus on reproductive justice in this kind of post-Roe moment?
I've been preoccupied over the last 7 years, I guess, with how we do the work as much as the work that we do. Because I think how we do the work is a predictor of what the work will result in. And so I wasn't really aware of the extreme nature of the call out culture until I really got into social media. But then I found online that people were saying the most unbelievably cruel things to each other that I doubted that they would say in person, but they were saying it. And but I really didn't care that it was happening a lot on the right because that's not who I organize. But I really cared about it happening on the left, among liberals, among progressives, among radicals, and all of that. And I am really pained by the fact that most people do it because they think they're doing the right thing. They think they're supposed to call people out as a way of holding them accountable for things that they've done wrong. But it thwarts their goal because if you use anger, blaming, and shaming as your way of pursuing accountability, actually all you've done is persuade people not to be held accountable because you have insulted them, you have disrespected them, you have caused harm to them. And why would they listen to you after that? It doesn't make any sense. And so a young trans man named Lone Tran, when they were 18 years old, created the concept of calling in. And I discovered this in my research for the book that I'm writing on calling in, the calling out culture. And I shouldn't have been surprised that a young person had countered it because they were the ones already immersed in social media. And so when I read their work, I began to realize that I had something based on my 50 years of social justice and human rights activism to contribute to the conversation, because in my 20s, I called in rapists, even though I was a rape and incest survivor. As I said, in the 40s, I was calling in Klansmen, and even though I was a survivor of racist violence.
Mhm.
Uh, Obviously, within the women's movement, I've had to call in a lot of problematic white women just to be a feminist. And so I thought that I had a lot that I could contribute to this conversation, because I'm really concerned about making a culture shift from calling people out into calling them in. And so I've created something that I call the 5C continuum, where there's calling out, where you publicly shame people for things you think they should be held accountable for. There's canceling people when you think that they should be lose their jobs or get deplatformed for something you think they've done wrong. There's calling in, where you hold people accountable, but you do it through love and respect instead of anger, blaming, and shaming. There's calling on people, where you demand that people do better, but you're not investing any time and attention in their growth. You're making them take responsibility for their growth. And then the most important, I think, of the 5 C's is calling it off. Learning when not to engage in an unproductive conversation with people who aren't operating in good faith, who actually do want to grow. If people are refusing to grow, then there's a question of whether or not you need to be engaged in them. And that's in person or on social media. And so now I offer these online classes, which started with COVID. I call them my $5 Walmart level classes, because it only costs $5 per lecture. But I've been able to convince thousands of people across the country to learn calling in techniques so that we can create a calling in culture within the human rights movement. And I'm very passionate about it. And people can go to my website, which is Loretta
Totally.
J. Ross, to find out about our calling in classes. I think our next one is a workshop that
Excellent.
we're doing.
We'd be happy to like let people know. Absolutely.
Right.
In terms of
Right.
that.
People want a workshop. So I think it's on September 10th that they want an actual hands-on workshop where you role play. How do you call somebody in, or how do you intervene in a blow up, or those kinds of things. And so
Awesome.
real
Awesome.
excited about the way thousands of people are thirsty for an alternative to all this bitterness and divisiveness that's happening amongst the left.
Yeah, no, totally. And I really appreciate the steps that you've taken in terms of the trainings, in terms of the workshops, the fact that you're doing this book. I mean, the role you're playing in this. I guess, you made reference to a couple of things in your past, like a couple of kind of major things that you've been involved in terms of your personal life as well. Can we go back in time? I think a lot of folks would want to hear your personal history, how you got into this work, how you see the thread, how you see kind of where we are now. And I don't know, would you mind like kind of giving kind of the Loretta overview of life?
Well, I've only told it to 1 million people at the Capitol, so during a protest, so I don't think it's a big secret right now. I had no intention of becoming a human rights or social justice activist. So I always call myself the accidental feminist, because it was not intentional. Um, I majored in chemistry and physics the first time I went to college, because I thought I was going to end up in a laboratory somewhere conducting experiments with inorganic compounds. But my plumbing got in the way. When I was 14, 10th grade of high school, a cousin used to get me drunk so that he could have sex with me. And he was 27 when I was 14, married. So he was totally inappropriate with me. And my mom and dad thought he was babysitting me, when in fact he was getting me drunk so that he could manufacture consent to sex. That was in the summer of 1968. And so I became pregnant as a result of that. And because of that, this was before Roe, so abortion was not an option for us unless we went to another country. And my poor parents weren't able to ship me off to another country. But what they did do was send me to a home for unwed mothers because I was supposed to have the baby in secret, give the baby up for adoption, and then return to college as if, I mean, return to high school as if I'd been on an extended vacation because I'd also in the 10th grade had received a preliminary scholarship to Radcliffe, and they did not want to jeopardize my scholarship to Radcliffe. I didn't want to jeopardize my scholarship to Radcliffe because this was in the 1960s when the elite white schools were picking the creme de la creme out of the Black community. And I had scored very high on the NNSQT test and all of that. Was in honors, what they call AP class now, all, from elementary school through high school. And so they had kind of cherry picked me of to get a preliminary scholarship to Radcliffe and admission. And so my parents and I agreed that a baby would jeopardize all of that. And so I had my son. By the time he was born, I had turned 15. He was born in 1969. But I'm not sure if it was because I gave birth at a hospital that was heavily influenced by the Catholic Church or not, because they were supposed to whisk my son away after he was born. I wasn't supposed to see him. Instead, they brought him to me and put him in my arms. That was not supposed to happen for a child that I had already signed the adoption papers for. And so this very strange mother bonding thing happened because I kept looking down at him and saying, "Oh my God, he's got my face. He's got my face. Oh my God, he's got my face." And I couldn't go through with the adoption. Um, and so I went from being a scared pregnant teen to a teen mom just that quickly. And fortunately, my parents were all supportive as they could be, even though I was extending my mother's parenting because she'd already raised 8 kids. And here I am bringing kid number 9 home because, here's a baby raising a baby. And so that was one of the things that got my attention because I couldn't decide if and when I had sex, if and when I had a baby. The only thing I could decide was whether to keep the child or not. Well, by the time I entered the 11th grade of high school, my whole world had changed. I mean, I was a parenting mom, and I probably was the only known parenting mom in my high school because most of the times when girls got pregnant, they secretly had the baby, gave the baby up, and like I said, pretended that they'd been on long vacations. So I had proof that I had had a baby. As a result, when I went to re enter my high school in the 11th grade, they didn't want to admit me. Uh, and I remember my high school counselor saying, "Well, Loretta, if we let you in, other girls might get pregnant." I was like, "I haven't even taken biology yet, and I know that ain't how that works." I can't impregnate other girls. And so my parents had to threaten to sue the San Antonio Independent School System for me to be readmitted to school. And fortunately it didn't have to go to court because they knew it was blatant sex discrimination. I mean, they never expelled the boys who got the girls pregnant, just the girls.
Yes.
And so that was the first time that I'd been part of taking on a big institution and winning, because I never thought that my parents weren't feminists. I mean, they were Southern conservative military, but they knew that they wanted me to have an education, and they would have done everything to guarantee my education. And so they took on the school system. I graduated high school at 16, went to Howard University on a scholarship because Radcliffe, by the way, rescinded their scholarship. They couldn't rescind the admission, but then they wrote me in my senior year and told me that they no longer had any scholarship money for me. After
Mhm.
promising me a scholarship for 2 years, right? They suddenly, it just evaporated. And so fortunately, Howard University offered me a full ride. And so that's why I ended up in Washington, D.C. Got a boyfriend in Washington, D.C. who was, while I was in my first year, as I said, majoring in chemistry, I had a boyfriend who was in his first year of law school at Howard University. And we started having sex. And I became pregnant, which was kind of logical because I had tried to persuade my mother to sign the permission slip for me to get birth control before I left for college. And she told me that a good Christian girl didn't need birth control. Okay, so quite predictably, I became pregnant my first year of college. And I was very fortunate that this pregnancy occurred in Washington, D.C., because D.C. decriminalized abortion 3 years before Roe. So this was 1970, and I was able to go to the Washington Hospital Center right in Washington, D.C., and have a perfectly legal abortion, safe abortion. And my obstacles weren't legal and they weren't financial because my law school boyfriend was more than happy to pay for it. It was familial. My mother would not sign the permission slip because she wouldn't sign for me to have birth control. Of course, she was not going to sign for me to have an abortion because of her Christian beliefs. And so my older sister Carol had to forge mom's signature on it because she's 9 years older than me. So she just forged mom's signature and sent it back to me. But that meant that I had a very late term abortion. I was a third trimester abortion because of the delays in arguing with my parent, with my mom. Cause dad was letting me do whatever I needed to do. He was like, take care of business. I got your back kind of stuff. It was mom and her Christianity. And, her Christianity persuaded her that women needed to be punished for having sex. I mean, she had that rock bottom belief, even if it ended up torpedoing my college education. Because that's what she said. Well, maybe you weren't meant to go to college. You need to just have that baby and come on home and raise your babies like God wants you to, kind of thing. I'm like, that would be a no.
Uh-uh. I mean, it's the thread is so clear. Like, and I so appreciate you telling that story. I mean, the thread is so clear in terms of the work that you do now. I mean, it's so like brilliantly clear. And I'm really struck with the fact that, activism is key, right? It's been key. It's key to how we stay engaged and active. But like, you tell that story and then we think about how much has changed and how little has changed. And then it becomes this question about how not to feel defeated by all that's happening right now. What keeps you motivated?
First of all, I believe that we're holding a winning hand. I know it doesn't feel like that sometimes, but when you think about it, the people who oppose us, the people who are fighting against human rights, they think they're fighting us, but they're not. They're fighting forces way beyond their power to control because they're fighting the truth, they're fighting evidence, they're fighting history, and most of all, they're fighting time. And any of those forces could kick their asses, even if we didn't do anything. I've never seen a group of men able to defeat time, truth, evidence, and history. Those things are on our side, and so that gives me a lot of hope. It's like, even in our messed up ways of doing everything wrong, we still hold a winning hand. I am concerned that we snatch defeat from the jaws of victory with this call out culture, which is why I'm so dedicated to that. But if we continue to use the human rights framework, recognize how interconnected we are, how interdependent we are, how humanity and the planet depends on us fighting the good fight and making sure about our species as well as our world surviving, I think we're going to win. I know we're going to win. I ain't gonna even think about it. I know we're going to win. And so that's what gives me hope. And just at the meta level, that's what gives me hope. Very specifically, young people. Oh my God. The energy and the freshness and the capacity of young people. It is every time I teach a class on white supremacy, which is what I teach at Smith, it's like sticking my finger into a socket of energy from these young people. I remember being a mouthy 16-year-old when I thought I knew everything, and now I'm dealing with a lot of mouthy 18-year-olds, and I love them. I love them, because we need that kind of fresh perspective, that energy. And these young people are far more intersectional and far more informed than any generation before them because they're on the internet. They're reading and absorbing so much, maybe in ways that I can't appreciate because I still don't understand TikTok addiction, but still.
That's not your thing. That's so let me ask you that. I mean, there's a lot of students attending today, and you talk about young people. When you look back at how you saw the world at that age, right? And then you think about how your career has developed. What's the advice you wish someone had given you? What advice do you want to give to young people now who are just beginning this journey of working at this intersection of public health and social justice?
Well, I was fortunate to get good advice, so I don't know if I have any. The problem wasn't that I didn't get good advice, I didn't listen very well. But it doesn't mean I wasn't offered it. Because I did my social justice development in Washington, D.C., as I spoke about, there were generations of older Black women who mentored me, even though they didn't like me. Because here I was with these baby dreadlocks popping out over my head and looking like, a nightmare with all these MFs running off of my tongue when they were practicing respectability politics with their hair all coiffed and, gloves and stuff, because they were the Mary McLeod Bethune generation, the people who um, had to be respectable to be listened to in their way. And so I remember this one woman named Ruth Sykes, who was an aide to Dorothy Height, who was then CEO of the National Council of Negro Women. And Sykes said a couple of things to me because we were both on the DC Commission for Women Together. And she said, Loretta, I know we had to have another Black woman on the commission, but I'm so sorry you're so Black. And she was not talking about my skin color because she was darker skinned than I was. She was talking about my affect because here I am, foul mouthed, dreadlocked, ready to call everybody out, including the mayor who had appointed me to the commission, Mayor Marion Barry, who had appointed me to the commission. And so she continued, she said, Loretta, maybe your job is to turn the table over. But you got to remember, we're the ones that got you into the room in the first place. So don't stop disrespecting us.
Love that.
And so she hated me. I don't think she liked me at all, but she didn't give up on me.
But she
Right.
respected you, yeah.
Yeah. And even as I made larger and larger mistakes, they never gave up on insufferable me. So I really try to pass that on.
I was just going to say, what's the advice you would give to people now?
Mm, First of all, understand the sacredness of the cause of human rights without taking yourself too seriously. The movement can be perfect, the cause can be perfect, and you don't have to be. We can bring our imperfect selves to the work. So that means that you have to learn the power of self forgiveness, stop pursuing this myth of, you know, perfect social justice work so that you're busy trying to criticize everybody else's practices and stuff, remembering that all social justice work is a great experiment. We don't know what we're doing. We're just going to keep trying till we get it right, that kind of thing. Another mentor of mine used to say, Loretta, lighten up. Leonard Zeskin used to say that to me. He said, Loretta, you need to lighten up. He said, fighting Nazis should be fun because being a Nazi is what sucks. And he's right. Just keep perspective here that if you're not having fun doing work in the cause of justice, then you're doing something wrong. And that also has sustained me. And in my own colloquial way, I just say party as hard as you work. Have a toggle switch where you can turn your consciousness on and off so that you can be serious at the same time when it's time to watch Twilight or something on TikTok. Turn the consciousness off so that you're not always being a Debbie Downer, bringing a deep feminist analysis to everything. Sometimes you just want to watch The Man Who Fell to Earth. You don't want to do
The analysis of it, yeah.
right. You just want to live a life. It's your affair. You just want to live. You don't want to always have to be on. And so that ability to turn my consciousness on and off is what's got me through 50 years.
I love it. And so, I've got two questions in the Q&A that I want to get to. And if anybody else has any that you want to add, but I'm conscious of our time, but I'm going to go to the second one first, actually, which is because it completely, I think, relates to this point, which is, how do you prevent burnout? I mean, I think in some ways you started to talk about that, but once folks are burnt out, how do you find your way back? I thought that was an excellent question that somebody posted.
Well, you give yourself time to heal because burnout is deeply related to the trauma that you haven't healed from. And so for me, when I was approaching burnout, and that's been a couple of times, it's not a one-time thing. The first time I was self-medicating, abusing drugs, and had to go get some actual therapy. And I've been in therapy ever since. I was 27 years old and I'm 69 now. So obviously that's one way to do it. Another way is to, as I say, have as many people in your life who are not political as are political, so that you have people who care about you, not because of political positions you hold or they hold, but because you're into human relationships with them. Uh, Lone Tran, who I spoke about earlier, offers this advice. He said, so many times young people want to go home and blow up the Thanksgiving dinner by, their politics, Daddy, you shouldn't say that. Mommy, you shouldn't do this. I want you to use the right gender pronouns for me and da 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 da. She said, the problem is, how many of you are having any kind of conversation with your parents of any substance before you decide to blow up the Thanksgiving table? Is that if you don't have, intentional quality relationships with these people, why do you think you can blow up on them and change them?
Yep.
Kind of thing. And so that's one way to avoid burnout, is to really invest in quality relationships with people you care about and people who care about you regardless of their politics. So that's one way that I use. Um, and then, like I said, party as hard as you work.
There you go. There you go. So that
I
can
take,
so I want to end with a more kind of political, very specific question, right? If I can, which is in this moment right now, in this post-Roe moment, there's a lot of questions about how to make sure that people still can access abortion, right? And so whether that's medical abortion, whether it's surgical, but the fact of people being able to access abortion. So what do you suggest that health administrators do, that doctors do, that the health system does? Like, is it a question about how is it that they can best engage to support people, since we all know the numbers of people seeking abortions aren't going to go down, it's just the number of safe abortions that are going to go down. How is it that you think the health system should best engage?
Well, I think the health system needs to engage by being flexible and adaptable, because right now, the majority of abortions are obtained through self-managed abortions. People aren't going for the surgical abortions as much. If they have access to the pills and can do it in the first trimester, that's what they're trying to do. They want to catch it early on. So our health service providers, healthcare providers are going to have to adapt to this changing technology the same way that newspapers had to adapt to, people getting their news over the internet. And if they fail to adapt, and they're dealing with the hostility of state legislators and stuff like that, they're not going to stay in business long. It's just the combination of things. So embracing telemedicine, embracing the midwifery and doula cultures that are there to help people deal with their reproductive health issues. Um, Perhaps getting out of those states that are more hostile, which unfortunately is going to create medical deserts for people who need reproductive health services. But it's going to be hard for a physician to argue to stay in a state where they could be jailed for 20 years for providing a necessary medical service. So,
Right.
not to mention not being able to obtain any liability insurance if they choose to do that.
Right.
And so I think the whole medical industry is going to have to change and shift. You're already seeing the shift with employers, where there are employers who are offering abortion services as a benefit now. Now, remember during healthcare reform under Obama, we had employers that didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And in a decade now, they've switched and say now we want to offer it as a paid benefit in order to attract and keep their best and brightest female workforce and those capable of being pregnant. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we're going to see some pretty stark contrasts between people who live in states with access and people who live in states without. And that's assuming that these Republicans don't get in power again and do a federal ban on abortion. But I think that a federal ban on abortion is probably going to have the same impact that prohibition had. Not work, but just create a criminal underground.
Right, with a very large criminal underground.
A very large, a multi-million person
criminal underground. Thank you. Thank you for that. And for me, I mean, I'll say just what I needed to hear, just what we needed to hear. I feel like you've given some hope, some direction for how we think about where we are now. I promised Loretta she has another engagement that we would end right at 1 o'clock. And so I'm very conscious of the time. But I just want to say, Loretta, thank you. Thank you for your good humor. Thank you for your substantive engagement. Thank you just for everything that you do. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor to have this conversation with you and to see you again, I have to say, as a human. With that, I guess let me just close by thanking everybody for attending, and thank you, everyone. Please visit our website and follow us to learn more about our work and the events that we have coming up. And have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.